The chamber of the Galactic Council stretched before Commander Daejung like a monument to species he no longer trusted. Crystalline walls reflected the light of 1,000 worlds, and representatives from 63 different civilizations sat in their designated pods, watching him with eyes that held expectations but never gratitude. He stood in the center of the room, his dark uniform crisp and formal, while his hands clenched behind his back hard, enough that his knuckles had gone white. Council Speaker Velthar raised one of his forearms, and the murmuring fell silent. The Velkeen were tall, thin creatures with skin that shimmered like oil on water. They had never fought a war themselves, but they were exceptional at ordering others to die in conflicts they orchestrated. Velthar's voice carried across the chamber with that particular tone of authority that beings developed when they had never been told no. Commander Daejung, the Council has reviewed the situation in the Outer Rim territories. The rebellion grows worse each day. The Theran government has requested assistance, and the Vok Confederacy threatens invasion if we do not intervene. We require your fleet to deploy immediately. Dodge had heard variations of this speech 100 times before. Always the same pattern. Always the same assumption that human lives were currency to be spent on galactic stability. He looked at the data display hovering before him. 70% of Earth's military strength? The number glowed red in the projection, but none of the Council members seemed to register its significance. 70% of our available forces, Daejung said slowly. That would leave Earth and her colonies with minimal defensive capability. We have our own borders to protect. Velthar made a gesture that Daejung had learned meant dismissal. The human territories are secure. There are no active threats to your systems. The galactic community needs your fleet where actual conflict exists. Your purpose has always been to serve the greater good of all civilized species. The words landed like stones in water. Your purpose. As if humanity existed only to bleed for aliens who could not be bothered to maintain their own defenses. Daejung thought of the memorial walls on Earth, endless names of humans who died in wars that meant nothing to their families. He thought of the treaty 60 years ago that had made humanity the Council's permanent peacekeeping force. A treaty signed when Earth was young and desperate for galactic acceptance. We'll convey your orders to my government, Daejung said quietly. He left the chamber without waiting to be dismissed. Behind him, he could hear the Council already moving to other business. The human deployment merely one item checked off an endless list of demands. They did not understand what he was about to do. They had grown too comfortable with human compliance. The journey back to Earth took 3 days through warp space. Daejung spent most of it in his quarters, reviewing casualty reports from the last 2 centuries. 40 million human soldiers dead in conflicts that humanity had no stake in. Trillions of credits spent building infrastructure on alien worlds, while Earth cities crumbled. Generation after generation of humans trained for war deployed to distant stars, and returned in boxes draped with flags from 100 different planets. President Hanna met him in the Oval Command Center, a room carved deep beneath the Himalayan mountains where Earth's government had relocated after the Skrull invasion 3 decades ago. She was a small woman, with gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen too many condolence letters cross her desk. She listened to Daejung's report without interruption, her fingers steepled in front of her face. 70%, she said when he finished. They want 70% of our fleet for another border dispute that will flare up again the moment we leave. Yes, Madam President. How many times have we deployed to the Theran Vok region? This would be the 4th major intervention in 60 years. Hannah stood and walked to the massive tactical display that dominated one wall. It showed the galaxy in 3 dimensions, human fleet positions marked in blue across hundreds of systems. Every blue marker represented human lives committed to protecting aliens who treated them as expendable. I've been reading the economic reports, Hannah said. Do you know that Earth's infrastructure is 140 years behind where it should be? We have cities without clean water because we've been building water purification plants on Velkeen colonies. We have hospitals without proper equipment because our medical technology goes to alien worlds. Our children attend schools that are falling apart while we construct universities on planets that don't even allow humans to attend them. Daejung said nothing. He knew all of this. Every military commander knew it. They just had orders to follow. The Council takes our service for granted, Hannah continued. They don't see us as partners or even as valued allies. We're tools to them. Convenient weapons they can deploy without risking their own people. She turned to face him. What would happen if we stopped? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dayun considered it carefully. The galaxy would burn, Madam President. Most of these species haven't maintained real military forces in generations. They've relied on us for everything from border patrol to riot control. Without human intervention, every suppressed conflict would resurface. Let it burn, Hannah said softly. We didn't start their wars. We didn't create their territorial disputes. For 200 years, we've been trying to earn our place in the galactic community by being indispensable. Maybe it's time we taught them what happens when we're gone. June felt something shift in his chest. It was the feeling of a weight he had carried for so long that he had forgotten it was there. You're serious? Act completely. Draft the withdrawal orders. Every human ship, every human soldier, every human diplomat comes home. We fulfill our current obligations, and then we're done. No more peacekeeping. No more mediating disputes between species that hate each other. No more dying for people who don't value our sacrifice. The Council will resist. They might impose sanctions, Hannah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Let them try. They need us more than we've ever needed them. It's time they learned that lesson. The orders went out that night on quantum channels that reached every corner of human-occupied space. The message was simple and clear. All human forces were to complete their current missions and then return to Earth jurisdiction. No new deployments would be accepted. The age of humanity as the galaxy's unpaid guardian was over. The Galactic Council received the notification at the start of their next session. Most representatives assumed it was a negotiating tactic, a bid for better terms or more resources. They had seen humans complain before, and they had always backed down when pressured. They had no idea that this time was different. They had no idea that President Hannah had already begun recalling the fleets. They had no idea that humanity had finally decided. They were worth more than the galaxies. Contempt. And they had absolutely no idea what was coming, Captain. Una stood on the observation deck of Outpost, Meridian, and watched the Theron ships approach. They came in a formation that screamed desperation, her hulls painted with the ceremonial colors reserved for diplomatic emergencies. She had been stationed at this fortress for 3 years, and in that time, she had never seen the Theron move with such obvious panic. The outpost hung in space like a gray mountain, human engineering at its finest. For 80 years, it had protected the Theron homeworld from invasion, its weapons platforms and sensor arrays, creating an invisible shield that had allowed an entire civilization to grow soft and complacent. Now that shield was coming down. Captain, the Theron delegation is requesting immediate docking permission, her communications officer said. They claim it's a matter of planetary security. Una knew what they wanted. The same thing every alien government had wanted since the recall orders came through 6 months ago. They wanted humans to stay. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted to pretend that 2 centuries of taking humanity for granted could be fixed with a few trade concessions and empty promises. Grant them permission. Doc 7. The Theron were a species that resembled Earth's beetles, with hard carapaces that gleamed in shades of green and gold. High Chancellor Trevkar led the delegation, his antennae twitching with barely controlled anxiety. He found Una in the cargo bay, where her crew was loading the last of the medical equipment onto transport ships. Captain Una, please. We must speak, Trevkar said. His translator rendered his clicking speech into flat, emotionless human standard. You cannot abandon this station. Our entire defensive strategy depends on human protection. Una continued supervising the cargo operation. You've had 80 years to develop your own defensive strategy, Chancellor. Our withdrawal has been public knowledge for 6 months. What have you done with that time? We've been attempting to purchase defense platforms from the Kesith Empire, but their prices are outrageous. We've tried to hire mercenary fleets, but none are willing to face potential VOC aggression. You know, the Vok have wanted our mining colonies since before your people arrived. Without human forces here, They'll invade within weeks. Then you should have treated our service as something valuable instead of something owed to you. Yuna finally turned to face him. Do you know how many humans died defending your borders? 4,372? Do you know how many times your government sent condolences or honored their sacrifice? 0. You took our protection and gave nothing in return except complaints when our patrols weren't frequent enough. Trevker's antennae drooped. We can change that. We're prepared to offer territorial rights in 3-star systems. Mining rights in the Khazari Belt? A seat on our planetary council? We're not negotiating, Chancellor. We're leaving. Across the galaxy, the same scene played out in 1,000 different locations. Lieutenant Jehoon oversaw the shutdown of the sensor network around the Kesher Nebula, a region so volatile that ships could be destroyed by spatial anomalies without warning. The network had taken 40 years to build and required constant maintenance by human technicians. Local governments had been warned 6 months ago to develop their own systems. None had bothered. Sir, the Kishari ambassador is threatening to file a formal complaint with the Galactic Council. His second officer reported Jot Ji-hoon didn't look up from his checklist. Let him complain. The Council has no authority over human decisions anymore. He watched as another sensor satellite was towed into the cargo hauler. How many ships have gone missing in the nebula since we announced the shutdown? 17 in the last month. Pirates are already moving into the region. Not our problem anymore. Engineer Sora worked on the dismantling of medical facilities that had served 17 different worlds. The plague that had swept through this sector 20 years ago had killed billions. Before human doctors arrived with vaccines and treatment protocols, the aliens had been grateful then, showering humanity with praise and promises of eternal friendship. Those promises had lasted exactly as long as the crisis. Dr. Sora, please reconsider, the local governor begged. We have no medical infrastructure to handle another outbreak. Our people will die, Sora continued, packing diagnostic equipment. Then I suggest you invest in training your own medical personnel. We provided detailed information on how to manufacture the vaccines. We offered to train your people. Your government said it was too expensive and that humans would always be here to handle it. We didn't know you would leave. You were told 6 months ago. You chose to believe it was a bluff. Diplomat Minho sat in the negotiation chamber of the Divided Zones, a region where 17 different species had been locked in territorial disputes for 3 centuries. Human mediators had managed to create a fragile peace that everyone knew was held together by nothing more than human presence and the threat of human intervention, if fighting resumed. The alien representatives sat around him, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusations and demands. The Vrin blamed the Keseth for border violations. The Keseth accused the Thalrics of espionage. The Thalrics demanded that the Prythene return stolen colony worlds. It was the same argument that had been happening for generations. Only now there were no humans to force compromise. Minho stood up, and the arguing stopped. They looked at him with expectation, waiting for him to propose another solution. It's another temporary peace that would buy them another decade of stability. I'm going home, Minho said simply. You should all do the same. Build your defenses. Prepare for war. Because that's what's coming the moment we leave. You cannot abandon the peace process, the Vrin representative said. We are close to a breakthrough. Minho laughed, and the sound was bitter. We've been close to a breakthrough for 60 years. The only thing preventing war is that you're all terrified of what happens if humans stop protecting you from each other? Well, now you get to find out. He walked out of the chamber, and behind him, shouting started again almost immediately. President Hannah monitored the withdrawal from her command center deep under the mountains. Holographic displays showed the steady stream of human ships returning home, pulling back from posts and stations and bases across the galaxy. The numbers were staggering. 80,000 military vessels, 2 million soldiers, 15,000 civilian contractors and support personnel, Madam President, were receiving hundreds of communications from the Galactic Council, her chief of staff reported. They're demanding an emergency session. They want you to address their concerns personally. Ignore them, Hannah said. They had 200 years to address our concerns. They're threatening economic sanctions. Let them. Earth has been functionally subsidizing the galactic economy for decades. They'll hurt themselves more than they hurt us. The final human ship departed Outpost Meridian 3 weeks after Yuna's conversation with Chancellor Trevker. She stood on the bridge and watched the fortress grow smaller in the view screen. Automated systems would keep it running for another month before power reserves depleted. What happened after that was no longer humanity's concern. Captain, sensors are detecting Vok military movements near the Theran border, her tactical officer said. Not our problem, Yuna said quietly. Set course for Earth. Ship's engines flared, and they slipped into warp, leaving behind a civilization that had never learned to protect itself. In the weeks that followed, every human presence in galactic space withdrew. Bases were abandoned. Embassies were closed. Humans disappeared from positions in alien governments, alien militaries, alien societies. The galaxy had grown accustomed to human protection, the way a child grows accustomed to a parent's care. They had never imagined that the parent might decide the child needed to learn independence. The Galactic Council held emergency session after emergency session. They passed resolutions condemning humanity's withdrawal. They debated sanctions and diplomatic pressure. They argued about who was responsible for losing humanity's cooperation. What they didn't do was prepare for what came next. Because in the shadows of every border, dispute humanity had mediated. In every territory humanity had protected. In every ancient grudge humanity had suppressed, something was stirring. The wars were coming back. All of them at once. And this time, it would be no human fleet to stop them. The first shots were fired exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after the last. Human patrol ship left the Theran Vok border. The Vok had been patient, waiting for confirmation that humanity truly wasn't coming back. When their scouts verified that Outpost Meridian sat dark and empty, the invasion fleet launched. The Theran Defense Force consisted of 40 outdated frigates and a command structure that hadn't fought a real battle in living memory. The Vok brought 300 warships and commanders who had spent 8 decades planning this invasion, waiting for the moment when human interference would no longer be a factor. The battle lasted for hours. The Theran lost their entire fleet and 17 orbital stations. By the end of the first day, Vok ground forces had landed on 3 colony worlds. The casualties were counted in millions. Ambassador Kyung sat in his retirement home on the outskirts of New Seoul and watched the news feeds with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. He had spent 40 years as humanity's representative to the Theran government, attending their councils, advising their leaders, building the relationships that were supposed to make humanity's protection unnecessary. He had failed. Or perhaps more accurately, they had failed to learn. The news showed refugees fleeing burning cities. Theran civilians who had lived their entire lives in peace suddenly faced an enemy they had no idea how to fight. The reporter, a young Theran female with a cracked carapace and terror in her eyes, begged for human intervention. The galaxy is watching this tragedy unfold, she said, her voice breaking. Where are the humans? Where are the peacekeepers who protected us for so long? How can they abandon us in our darkest hour? Kyung set down his tea. He had heard variations of this sentiment 1,000 times during his career. Always the same assumption that human protection was a right rather than a gift. Never any acknowledgement of what that protection cost. His communicator chimed. It was his daughter, Sora, the engineer, who had been dismantling medical facilities across the sector. Her face appeared in the hologram, tired but determined. Father, have you seen the news from Theran? I'm watching it now. They're calling for us to come back. There are protests on Earth, people saying we should intervene, Kun sighed. There will always be protests. There will always be people who believe we have a moral obligation to save everyone. But those people don't understand what we've already given. They don't understand that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. The Kesher Nebula descended into chaos even faster than anyone predicted. Without the human sensor network, ships entered the volatile region blind. Pirates who had been held in check by human patrols now operated with complete freedom. 3 major trade routes collapsed in the first week. Merchant vessels refused to travel through the nebula, forcing them to take routes that added weeks to their journeys. The economic impact rippled across dozens of star systems. Goods that depended on quick transport spoiled in cargo holds. Industries that relied on rare minerals from the nebula shut down. Thousands of businesses failed. Millions lost their jobs. The Kishari government, which had threatened to file complaints when humans announced the network shutdown, now faced a population demanding answers. Their ambassador to the Galactic Council gave an impassioned speech about human responsibility and moral obligation. He conveniently forgot that his government had been offered the sensor network technology for free and had refused. It is too expensive to maintain. The divided zones erupted into violence so quickly that it shocked even the most pessimistic observers. Within 72 hours of the human mediators leaving, 4 different species declared war on each other. Ancient territorial claims that had been suppressed for generations suddenly became worth dying for again. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Species that had relied on humans to enforce peace treaties now discovered that without enforcement, treaties were just words. Civilians who had grown up in human-maintained stability suddenly found themselves dodging artillery fire and fleeing from invasion forces. General Dalcor of the Vrin Dominion was considered the finest non-human military commander in the galaxy. He had studied at human war colleges and commanded mixed-species forces under human supervision. When the Galactic Council appointed him to lead their new peacekeeping force, there was genuine optimism that he could replicate human success. That optimism lasted. 6 days, Thelcor took his fleet to the HFY War, intending to enforce a ceasefire through overwhelming force. He had 30,000 ships, drawn from a dozen different species, and detailed tactical plans based on human peacekeeping doctrine. What he didn't have was 2 centuries of experience or the infrastructure that made human peacekeeping possible. His fleet arrived in the combat zone to find a situation far worse than intelligence suggested. The Vok had already captured 12 colony worlds and showed no interest in negotiating. The Theran were fighting with a desperation that bordered on suicidal, using tactics that caused massive civilian casualties on both sides. Thelcor tried to position his forces between the 2 fleets, the classic human peacekeeping maneuver. But his ships came from different military traditions, with different communication protocols and different rules of engagement. When the Vok fired on his forward elements, 3 different species interpreted. They attacked differently and responded with conflicting tactics. The resulting confusion allowed the Vok to punch through his lines and destroy 200 peacekeeping vessels before Thelcor could restore order. He retreated, regrouped, and tried again with a different strategy. The result was even worse. By the end of the 6th day, his fleet had lost 7,000 ships and accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty count. Thelcor returned to the council in defeat. "We cannot do this," he told them bluntly. Human peacekeeping looked simple because they made it look simple. They had unified command structures, standardized equipment, and most importantly, they had presence. Thousands of ships at every conflict point, tens of thousands of soldiers ready to deploy at a moment's notice. We don't have the resources or the training or the institutional knowledge to replicate what they've built over 200 years. The council sat in stunned silence. They had genuinely believed that peacekeeping was just a matter of having enough ships and the will to use them. They had never understood the complexity of what humans had been doing. On Earth, civilian analyst Hyen worked in a small office in the strategic planning department. Her job was to model potential scenarios and their outcomes. She had spent 6 months creating projections for what would happen after humanity's withdrawal. Now she was watching those projections come true with frightening accuracy. She compiled her latest report, sent it to President Hanna. The numbers were devastating. 12 major wars had erupted in 3 months, exactly as predicted. The galactic economy had contracted by 38% and was still falling. Refugee populations were approaching 1 trillion beings. The casualty count was already at 70 billion and climbing. President Hanna read the report in her command center, surrounded by displays showing the galaxy burning. Her advisors watched her carefully, waiting for her reaction. Some of them had argued for limited intervention for humanitarian missions to help refugees, for something that would ease the suffering. Hannah had refused every suggestion. If we intervene now, even in small ways, we teach them the wrong lesson. We show them that if they suffer enough, humans will come back and fix their problems. They need to learn that their security is their responsibility. Madam President, the Council is sending another delegation, her Chief of Staff reported. They're offering everything. Full voting rights, reparations, technology sharing agreements. They're completely capitulating to our demands. Tell them we'll consider their offer, Hannah said. In 6 months? 6 months? The casualty projections for 6 months are catastrophic. Yes, they are. Hannah's voice was cold. That's the cost of their 200 years of complacency. Every being that dies in these wars dies because their governments chose to rely on human protection instead of building their own capabilities. This is not our fault. This is not our responsibility. This is the price they pay for taking us for granted. The Council's messages became more desperate. They offered territorial concessions. They offered economic partnerships. They offered to make humanity the permanent military commanders of all galactic forces. Every offer was carefully worded to make it sound like they were granting humans great privileges, as if humanity needed anything from them. The truth that they still hadn't grasped was that humanity didn't need the galaxy at all. Earth's economy was recovering as resources that had been flowing to alien worlds were redirected to human needs. The colonies were more secure with the fleet concentrated in human space. The population was relieved to see their soldiers coming home instead of dying for aliens who didn't value their sacrifice. But the galaxy burned, and in the depths of space, something else was stirring. The Skrell had been watching and waiting. They had fought humanity to a standstill 30 years ago, but they had never forgotten the taste of defeat. Now they saw opportunity. The galaxy that had relied on human protection was weak, fractured, and bleeding. The time for revenge had come. The human fleet dropped out of warp at the edge of the Kesseth border zones. And what they saw made even experienced commanders draw sharp breaths. 15 star systems burned. Colony worlds that had held billions of lives now showed only the heat signatures of nuclear fire. Debris fields stretched for millions of kilometers. The shattered remains of defensive fleets that had tried to stand against the Skrell. Advance. Admiral Dejung studied the tactical displays with cold calculation. The Skrell fleet was larger than intelligence had estimated, nearly 10,000 vessels moving in coordinated battle groups. They were advancing on 3 major population centers simultaneously, and at their current rate of progress, they would reach inhabited space within 70 hours. Status of Council forces? He asked. Scattered and ineffective, sir, his tactical officer replied. General Thelkor is trying to coordinate a defense at the Heskin system, but he has maybe 800 ships from a dozen different species. They're not going to last an hour against a Skrell battle group. Dejun made his decision quickly. Split the fleet. Battle Group Alpha, under my command, moves to intercept the primary Skrell force. Battle Group Beta, under Captain Yuna, defends the Heskin system. Battle Group Gamma holds reserve position and prepares for rapid deployment where needed. The orders rippled through the fleet, and 3,000 human vessels began moving with a precision that the scattered Council forces could never match. Every ship knew its role. Every captain understood the tactical doctrine. Every crew had trained together for exactly this kind of large-scale combat operation. The Skrell had been preparing for this war for 30 years, but they had made one critical miscalculation. They thought humanity would be spread across the galaxy like it had been during the last war, tied down by peacekeeping obligations and unable to concentrate force. They had no idea that every human ship, every human soldier, every human resource was now focused on a single objective. The first battle happened at the Meridian Line, a region of space where 3 shipping lanes converged. The Skrell sent to battle groups to secure it. Nearly 2,000 ships led by War Commander Jektal, who had fought humans before and survived. He was confident that his forces could break through any resistance and continue the advance. he met Admiral Daejung instead. The human fleet emerged from warp in perfect formation, their weapon systems already charged and targeting solutions calculated. The Skrell barely had time to react before human railguns opened fire, sending projectiles at relativistic speeds through their forward elements. Shields that had been designed to withstand energy weapons proved useless against kinetic impacts traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. Jektil tried to respond with the tactics that had worked so well against other species: overwhelming firepower, rapid assault, break the enemy formation, and pursue individual vessels. But human ships didn't break formation. They moved like a single organism, each vessel supporting the others, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the space around them into a killing zone. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the Skrell had lost 1,400 ships. Human casualties were 97 vessels, and most of those were damaged rather than destroyed. Jektil's flagship was a drifting wreck, his dreams of conquest. Burning in the vacuum of space, Captain Yuna arrived at the Heskin system to find General Thelkor's fleet already engaged with the Skrell battle group. The Council forces were fighting bravely but ineffectively, their different tactical doctrines creating gaps that the Skrell were exploiting ruthlessly. Open channel to General Thelkor, Yuna ordered. The Vryn general appeared on her screen, his face showing the strain of losing a battle he knew he couldn't win. Captain Yuna, we cannot hold them. We need immediate evacuation support for the civilian population. Pull your forces back to coordinates I'm transmitting, Yuna said. Form a secondary defensive line behind my fleet. We'll handle the Skrell. Thelkor looked like he wanted to argue, to maintain some pride in his force's abilities. Then another of his ships exploded on the tactical display and he made the smart choice. Withdrawing as ordered, the Council fleet pulled back, and Yuna's battle group moved forward to meet the Skrell advance. She had 500 ships against 800 Skrell vessels, but she had something the Council forces lacked: decades of experience fighting these particular enemies, knowledge of their tactics, understanding of their weaknesses. All ships, execute pattern Delta, she ordered. The human vessels split into 3 groups, creating a formation that looked like a defensive retreat. The Skrell took the bait and surged forward, trying to exploit what appeared to be a breaking formation. Instead, they flew directly into a trap. The retreating groups suddenly reversed course, while a 4th group, that had been running silent under stealth systems, appeared. Behind the Skrell fleet, the aliens found themselves surrounded and subjected to a withering crossfire. They tried to break through, but every direction they turned led to more human ships. In 40 minutes, the battle was over. The Skrell battle group was destroyed. General Thelkor watched from his command ship in something like awe. How did you do that? We outnumbered them by nearly 300 ships, and we're losing badly. Experience, Yuna said simply. We've been fighting wars for 200 years, while the rest of the galaxy grew soft. You forgot what real combat looks like. We never did. The war continued for 3 weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Skrell had expected to face a fractured galaxy with no unified defense. Instead, they encountered a human military operating at full capacity, with clear supply lines, unified command, and decades of combat experience. Every time the Skrell tried to adapt to human tactics, the humans changed their approach. Every time the Skrell concentrated forces to overwhelm a human fleet, they found that the humans had already anticipated the move and repositioned. It was like watching a professional fighter compete against an amateur. The difference in skill was simply too vast to overcome through numbers alone. On the Vryn homeworld, civilians watched their skies darken with Skrell ships and waited for death. The Skrell had bypassed the human defensive lines and made straight for Vryn space. Knowing that humanity had declared these systems outside their protection, it was meant to create division, to force humanity to either break their word or watch billions die. President Hannah received desperate pleas from Vryn civilians. From non-military personnel who had no part in the attack on New Busan, she received messages from religious leaders. From children, from parents begging her to save their families, she watched the communications in her command center, her face showing no emotion. Her advisors waited for her decision, some of them clearly uncomfortable with the idea of abandoning innocents to punish guilty leaders. Madame President, her chief of staff, said quietly, "We could deploy a battle group. Save the civilians, at least." Hana was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "No, the Vrin government made a choice when they attacked New Busan. They gambled that they could force our compliance through violence. They lost. Their civilians will pay the price for their leaders' arrogance, just as our civilians paid with their lives." It was the hardest decision she had ever made. But it was also necessary, because if humanity intervened now, if they saved the Vrin, despite their promise, then every other species would learn that human words meant nothing, that violence and desperation could force human compliance even when treaties and negotiations failed. The Skrell bombardment of the Vrin homeworld lasted 6 days. 3 billion beings died. It was a tragedy of enormous scale, and it was broadcast across every channel in the galaxy. The message was clear. Human protection was no longer automatic. It had to be earned through respect and maintained through honor. Admiral Sum Dejung led the final assault against the Skrell command fleet personally. He found them regrouping at the edge of galactic space, preparing for either a final offensive or a retreat back to their territory. He gave them no time to decide. The human fleet hit them with everything they had: railguns and missiles and energy weapons fired in coordinated volleys that shredded shields and tore through armor. Fighters launched from carrier ships and overwhelmed Skrell point defenses. Boarding parties teleported onto command vessels and captured or killed. High-ranking officers, the Skrell war commander, stood on the bridge of his dying flagship and sent a final transmission to Daejun. "You were supposed to be scattered, weak, divided across 1,000 worlds." "We were," Daejun replied, "but we came home, and we'll never make the mistake of spreading ourselves so thin again." The war ended 3 weeks and 4 days after the first human fleet deployed. The Skrell were pushed back beyond the galactic rim, their invasion fleet destroyed, their military capabilities shattered. They would not threaten the galaxy again for generations. The cost to humanity was 1,200 ships and 46,000 casualties. A heavy price, but one that humanity paid willingly because they were fighting for their own interests rather than galactic obligation. The cost to the galaxy was measured in the trillions. Destroyed worlds, shattered civilizations, the Vrin Dominion reduced to a fraction of its former power, and a fundamental shift in how every species viewed humanity. The memorial was built on Earth. In Geneva, where the original Galactic Council Treaty had been signed 213 years earlier, it was a vast structure of black stone and crystal, etched with the names of every human who had died in galactic service. 40 million names. 40 million people who had given their lives for aliens who barely remembered them. Every galactic leader attended the dedication ceremony. They stood in the rain and listened as President Hana read names from the memorial. They heard the stories of soldiers who died holding positions that aliens abandoned. Diplomats who were killed trying to negotiate peace between species that hated each other. Engineers who were lost building infrastructure on worlds that would never honor their sacrifice. Council. Speaker Velthor spoke on behalf of the galaxy, his voice broadcast to every inhabited world. "We took you for granted. We assumed your service was our right. We forgot that protection is a gift, not an obligation. We will not forget again." The new Galactic Council Treaty was signed that same day. It gave humanity full voting rights and leadership positions. It established reparation payments that would continue for 50 years. Most importantly, it recognized that human military service was exactly that, service. Something offered freely and which could be withdrawn if not. Respected. Admiral Daejung retired after the war and became the Director of Galactic Defense. Overseeing a military structure where human forces would never again be spread so thin, Captain Yuna commanded the new Rapid Response Fleet. Positioned to defend humanity's interests first and galactic peace second, General Thalcor became her student. Learning human tactical doctrine and teaching it to Council military forces, President Hana served 2 more terms and then retired to write her memoirs. The first line of her book became famous across the galaxy. We walked away because we had to. We came back because we chose to. That's the difference that the galaxy needed to learn. The wars that had erupted during humanity's withdrawal eventually ended, but not before reshaping the political landscape of the galaxy. Species learned to defend themselves or formed alliances with those who could. The age of depending on human intervention as a default solution was over. In humanity, they returned to their role as peacekeepers, but on their own terms. They deployed when asked properly and compensated fairly. They protected those who respected them and ignored those who didn't. They built a galactic order where their service was valued because it could be withdrawn. They had learned the hard way that the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of taking you for granted. The galaxy had learned that some protectors would walk away if pushed too far, and together they built something better than what came before.